Brought to you by Charity Mobile. Switch to the phone company that supports your beliefs. All plans start under $50 before taxes and surcharges. Use promo code TRADITION at CharityMobile.com for a special offer. Yesterday went from a rather dull day in the news to suddenly very interesting when a few small stories came together along with a larger story that suddenly painted us an interesting picture. Pope Leo XIV has a major test for unity coming up. How he faces this test is going to say a lot. That test is on a number of subjects, but for us today, it's on the subject of the Mass, and a secondary subject as well. Will Pope Leo XIV address Traditionis Custodis? Will he roll it back? Will he make it worse? Will he do nothing? We don't know, and we won't know until he actually does something concrete. We have some good indications of how things just might play out. The first story to break yesterday was something that didn't seem that important in isolation. Cardinal Arthur Roach, prefect of the Dicastery for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments, met with Pope Leo XIV for the first time in a private audience. By itself, not that big of a deal. As you'll recall, the Pope kept, on day one, everybody who was running a Vatican dicastery in their office for the time being. And he said he would make his personnel decisions down the line. It would stand to reason that as part of that process, he would meet with the prefects of the dicasteries. So meeting with a Vatican prefect is anyway not that big of a deal in isolation. But the story was broken here by Mr. Michael Haynes of LifeSite, who posted it to X. He said, Pope Leo XIV received Cardinal Roach in audience this morning for the first time in his pontificate, at least officially. It marks the first formal papal audience Cardinal Roach has had since mid-December. As with all heads and secretaries of Roman Curia, Cardinal Roach was temporarily reinstated. Not that big of a deal, again, in isolation. And I didn't think much of it at first because, again, he was going to meet with him at some point. They all meet with him regularly. Every prefect will, regularly being on different schedules depending on what the focus at the time is. Meetings were inevitable because the Pope's actions on personnel will tell us everything. He has a lot of personnel decisions to make, and those decisions are going to tell us a lot more than what he says in addresses and things, because personnel is policy. Roach, like Cardinal Fernandez, was temporarily reinstated to the post he held under Pope Francis, and that's pretty normal, though. The two men I've just mentioned are abnormally unqualified men, which left many of us wondering why he'd bother to keep them around at all. No one in their right mind thinks Cardinal Fernandez belongs anywhere near the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith or anything else in the Roman Curia. And as Mr. John Henry Weston did tell us, as like I just said here, in fact, I was thinking this the same thing, and I was happy to see him post it yesterday on X. He said here, personnel is policy. And he said, sources in Rome say new heads of Vatican dicasteries to be announced by late August. That's big. Just a few months left to gauge Pope Leo XIV's direction. Remember, personnel is policy. And so it could be the case that we will get a lot of very questionable men occupying these positions while the Pope says all the things we've come to like that he says. Or it could be he'll put some really good men up there, or more likely, we're going to get a mixed bag. After all, he does speak a lot about unity. And you can't be the Pope of unity if you alienate an entire faction in the Roman Curia. That's just, unfortunately, something he's going to have to deal with. But personnel is policy. And so you bear that in mind as we talk about this, because it stands to reason that the Pope would want to meet with Roach face-to-face and get to know him, or at the very least, let him know what was going to happen if most of these decisions were made by late August. And if it had been all that had happened yesterday, I'd be talking to you about something entirely different right now. You see, Roach is the author of Traditionis Custodis. He's the man who wrote the documents and enforced them restricting the traditional Latin Mass back in 2021. Both Traditionis Custodis and the responses ad dubia issued just before Christmas of that year, as well as a few other things that happened afterwards. It's also the one who typically is going to be he or people working for him who answer questions from bishops who are trying to find a way to not implement Traditionis Custodis. They've granted exceptions for some dioceses, extensions for some, but others who asked for guidance were told to end all of their masses in their diocese. That's what we're talking about here. See, with the news of personnel changes coming, And with a mess in Charlotte and other parts of the U.S. where Latin Mass restrictions have suddenly out of the blue been announced, it stands to reason that whatever is done with Cardinal Roach was going to tell us a lot about Pope Leo XIV. However, one bit of misinformation happened yesterday. I'm going to address it before I get to the update out of Charlotte that is directly connected to all of this. Lepanto Institute posted this. I'm not accusing them of misinformation. I'm going to show you what happened here. He's responding to this. Eccles, at Brother Eccles. Cardinal Roach has been reassigned. I won't say where. And he shows some pictures with penguins. And Lepanto says that word on the street is that Cardinal Roach, the one responsible for the draconian imposition of Traditioncustod, has been reassigned to the Falklands. If this is true, it's a massive win for traditional Catholics and a sign that Pope Leo is not Francis II. The thing is, this story is not true. Brother Eccles said elsewhere that he'd been reassigned to the Falkland Islands. There's one parish on the Falkland Islands, and they'd bring a priest in from the mainland to go say the masses there. Eccles is a satirist. He runs a satire blog called Eccles is Saved, and it's humorous. It's actually really funny. This is a satirical post. It's not true. So, and a lot of people be like, well, how can you not tell that it's satire? Well, it's simple. We live in weird times, and people are having a harder and harder time telling fact from fiction. That is the simple fact of the matter. So this is understandable how that could have happened. So no, Cardinal Roach was not reassigned, at least not yet. He may well be in August, but he hasn't yet, and it probably won't be to the Falkland Islands. The meeting with Roach happened early in the morning, well before business started in the United States. And this is what makes the next story so compelling. The diocesan newspaper for the Diocese of Charlotte gives us a gigantic piece of news. And it makes me wonder, did Bishop Michael Martin of Charlotte get a call from Rome? Headline: Bishop grants request to pause restrictions on Latin Mass until Vatican's October deadline. And there's something in this article that makes me wonder if he got a call from Rome after Cardinal Roach had his meeting with the Pope. Vatican's like 7 hours ahead of where I'm sitting in the central U.S. So Roach meets with him in the morning, and then suddenly you get this out of the diocese. And I don't think it's a coincidence. Here's the full article, very short. Quote, changes to traditional Latin Mass offerings in the Diocese of Charlotte will take effect October 2nd to align with a deadline mandated by the Vatican, not July 8th as previously planned, Bishop Michael Martin announced Tuesday. The new date allows more time for the transition and for renovation of a chapel designated for the traditional Latin Mass community, Bishop Martin said in an email to priests Tuesday. The move is the final phase of the diocese's gradual implementation of Pope Francis's 2021 instruction, Traditioncustod, which prescribes limits on the traditional Latin Mass in dioceses around the world, but allows bishops to set up alternate worship sites. The diocese is setting aside a chapel in Mooresville for celebration of the TLM, which averages approximately 1,100 regular attendees each week. They currently worship at 4 diocesan churches using the older form of the Mass, which uses prayers and a calendar predating the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. The changes were set to take effect in conjunction with the diocese's annual clergy assignments on July 8th, which include the appointment of Father Brandon Jones as TLM chaplain. On Tuesday, however, Bishop Martin accepted a request from the 4 parish priests that he wait until the Vatican's deadline of October 2nd to implement the changes. The extra time will allow the pastors to accompany people through the transition. For renovations to be completed, the bishop and pastors agreed. We'll pause here. None of this sounds all that unusual, even almost like an act of charity and mercy on the behalf of the Bishop of Charlotte, right? But there's some other details here that are eyebrow-raising. It made sense to start these changes in July when dozens of our priests will be moving to the new parishes and other assignments, Bishop Martin told the Catholic News Herald. That said, I want to listen to the concerns of these parishioners and their priests, and I'm willing to give them more time to absorb these changes. Extensive renovation work is already underway at the chapel in Mooresville, and diocesan construction officials said they expect it to be ready this October. In the interim, Bishop Martin said, should the Vatican issue any official changes to Traditioncustod, the diocese would abide by those instructions. Now, that's a weird thing to just throw out there. A June 24th meeting for TLM supporters at the new chapel site in Mooresville has also been postponed. And then it goes on to talk about everything else that's happened, the background on all of this and how much it's going to cost, and things not terribly relevant to the larger picture. See, I'm not the only one who can do a little bit of math here, and it could be just reading too much into it. I fully admit that might be the case. But I'm not the only one who did this. You see, Diane Montagna, the Vatican journalist who during the Synod on Synodality was the person in the press pool asking a lot of very uncomfortable questions for the synodalist cardinals who were talking about bringing a new church into existence at the Synod on Synodality. She asked the questions most of us would have liked to have asked. And she can do the basic math. In the morning, the Pope meets with Cardinal Roach, the man responsible for enforcing the will of the Pope about the liturgy. And then a few hours later, suddenly Bishop Michael Martin of North Carolina backtracks and gives the game away, potentially by saying that whatever ruling from Rome comes, he will abide by it. Fascinating. Here's what she said. Just in, restrictions to the traditional Latin Mass in the Diocese of Charlotte have been paused until October 2nd, Bishop Martin has announced. In the interim, Bishop Martin said should the Vatican issue any official changes to Traditioncustod, the diocese would abide by those instructions, says the local diocesan newspaper. Earlier today, Pope Leo XIV received an audience of Prefect of the Dicastery for Divine Worship, Cardinal Arthur Roach. It is unknown if the Charlotte TLM restrictions were discussed, because the details haven't been brought forward. But it was, she points out, it was brought forward. It was actually listed in the bulletin for what the Pope is doing every day. And it's pretty clear, at least in the minds of some, many think this is a sign that the traditional Mass is going to have the restrictions lessened to some degree, whether that's a full reinstitution of Summorum Pontificum and a full rescinding of Traditionis Custodes, or something in between. It could also be something else. People need to brace for also a negative reality happening, that it could get worse. After all, the diocese is spending tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars renovating a chapel for the traditional Mass goers to be set away, far away from everybody else. They're still spending that money. And in a modern church in America, that's a big deal because everybody's broke. Every diocese is pretty much broke and can't just renovate chapels willy-nilly. So hope for the best, pray for the best, be ready for an alternate outcome that you won't like. Now, there is something here that is noteworthy in this as well. And again, I'm happy when others notice this. Just another Catholic says, this tells me that Rome is in fact examining the future of Traditionis Custodes. Even if that decision isn't abandoning it, it is being reviewed. Both the mention about future guidelines before October and the canceling of the June 24th meeting. So another detail from that same article said, in the interim, Bishop Martin said, should the Vatican issue any official changes to Traditionis Custodes, the diocese would abide by those instructions. A June 24th meeting for TLM supporters at the new chapel site in Mooresville has also been postponed. So the bishop was going to meet with traditional Mass goers, either he was or some auxiliary of his, to discuss the future. And that's been canceled. Everything pushed back for an October 2nd deadline. Now, as for the Diocese of Charlotte, we have the National Catholic Register also providing an interesting story for all of this. It helps us to understand why this is going to be a major test for the Pope, because this is frankly a big test for him, because he's going to be getting pushes on all sides. And something I'm going to talk to you about in the coming days is this. Most of the bishops in the church are now becoming what some are calling provostians, which I don't like that term, but that's the one I've seen used. The same bishops who were Bergoglians before are now suddenly aligning themselves with the Pope. And you would think that's a good thing. But there's a lot of also what you might call wish casting going on among bishops and high-profile Catholics, which is to put all their hopes and dreams on what this Pope will do. You've seen it from American Magazine types and the National Catholic Reporter types, and you've seen it from traditionally minded Catholics as well. So there's a lot of almost like propaganda to try to co-opt the Pope for their own particular ideological purposes. But here's the National Catholic Register with the headline, Pope Leo XIV faces an early challenge. How to deal with the Pope Francis's restrictions on the Latin Mass. And it starts out with a lot of, nuts and bolts stuff. What the restrictions are, where they came from, all that stuff. And one thing that's worth being reminded of is I covered earlier in the week, or in the last few days. The Vatican made a claim, Cardinal Arthur Roach did, that they did a survey of the bishops of the world and found that many bishops were complaining about the Latin Mass being a source of division and schism in their dioceses. It turned out when he broke the numbers down, most bishops didn't even respond to the survey to begin with, and the ones who did it was like less than 30%. And so when you break down the survey numbers using some survey math, it's like 6% of bishops said it was a problem in their diocese. So clearly the survey was not what you would base these kind of decisions on. But that's context, because Roach probably believes what he said, believes that bit of propaganda. Here's what the National Catholic Register tells us are the options. And remember, the National Catholic Register is the print arm of EWTN. To give you an idea of their bias. They say, quote, "What are the options available to the Holy Father, and how might he implement them?" Speaking to a number of leading church figures knowledgeable about the issue, all agreed that the Pope needs to take some action rather than let the situation continue as it is. Catholic writer and expert on the traditional liturgy, Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, said that although it is not good for stability of the church to have continual back and forth shifts from papacy to papacy, he believes no other option exists for Pope Leo than to openly reverse Traditionis Custodes. Softening the implementation of it without directly redressing his assertions will not make the underlying falsehoods of that document go away, he said, but rather send a subtle message that anything goes. He proposed that if Pope Leo wanted to save face, he could issue another document clarifying or adjusting Traditionis Custodes, in which he essentially returned to the bishops their authority to approve the traditional Latin Mass and praise its benefits to the faithful who love it for the right reasons. Although another alternative, he said, could be to say the past 4 years have brought to our attention the difficulties and hardships that the policy of my predecessors have occasioned, and we judge it opportune to restore the policy of Benedict XVI Summorum Pontificum. So Dr. Kwasniewski's suggestions on this. Catholic writer and register contributor Amy Wellborn agreed with a possible reversion to it, saying that although it was not perfect, it did appear to be working. The Pope, she said, could perhaps offer a simple statement, saying that in the context of the current time and understanding of the needs of the moment, Traditionis Custodes is no longer useful in the present moment and context, and so reverting to Summorum Pontificum would do for a start. Consistent with Pope Leo's and the Church's focus on mission, Wellborn also believes Leo could recall Benedict XVI's conviction, made clear in his letter accompanying Summorum Pontificum, that both forms of the Mass are valid. He could call it for the deepest, perhaps self-sacrificial charity on the part of laity and clergy in living this out in ecclesial life, and no matter what form, and no matter which rite, Latin or Eastern, for Catholics to be joyfully nourished by Christ in the gift of the Eucharist and strengthened to go out into the world so deeply in need of Christ's love. And you get another one here from Joseph Shaw, and I think this one's interesting. He says, an alternative to reverting to Summorum Pontificum could instead be a binding interpretation and application of Traditionis Custodes, said Joseph Shaw, chairman of the Latin Mass Society of Great Britain, who favors a short document returning decision-making to bishops and allowing all priests to celebrate the Old Mass in all churches. He believes this would take a lot of heat out of the problem and tailor it to local conditions, although he acknowledged some bishops will feel pressured to either allow it or forbid it by some of the faithful. Others foresee a possible gradual detachment from Francis's treatment of the old liturgy. Stuart Chessman, a U.S. expert on the traditional Mass, does not predict peace returning to the Church anytime soon, but wonders if this war of annihilation against traditionalism, which he sees as really a war against her own heritage, can be sustained long-term. And I think that is a very sober assessment. But as a counter-argument to that, because there's a lot of that is built on this attitude, the war on tradition, is that traditional Catholics are accused of being schismatic, especially if you say anything nice or supportive of the Society of St. Pius X, the SSPX, whom have never been declared to be in schism. There's a difference between a schismatic act and being in schism. In fact, the Vatican has a number of times said they're not in schism. They just have an irregular situation, and it's an internal church matter, trying to give people a hint to stop spending so much time thinking about this stuff. But Eric Sam has posted this interesting anecdote here, and I wanted to end on this. I think this is a good attitude to have. Eric Sam has posted this: the SSPX are the worst schismatics. And by the worst, he doesn't mean like they're the most evil. He means they're really bad at being schismatic. And here's why. This is a screenshot from the Facebook group Charlotte Latin Mass Community. They made this publicly available, and I'm going to recount this story to you. It's a sign of hope. Here's a heartwarming update from the SSPX Chapel, Mount Holly, St. Anthony of Padua. This is in the Charlotte Diocese. Just before the May 23rd decree from Bishop Martin suppressing the Latin Masses offered by the diocese, the men of the Holy Name Society at St. Anthony's requested a traditional Mass of Thanksgiving that was offered by Father John Bourbeau, FSSPX, that would be the SSPX, on the occasion of the one-year anniversary of Bishop Martin's election as a Bishop of Charlotte. They marked the occasion by sending this beautiful parchment. In addition, since at each Mass at St. Anthony's, the priests of the SSPX include the names of Bishop Martin and Pope Leo XIV in the prayers of the canon of the Mass, they asked Bishop Martin for an official portrait to hang in the SSPX chapel in Charlotte. Bishop Martin granted the request and sent his official portrait to the SSPX chapel. And lastly, after the bishop's decree suppressing the Latin Mass, the men of the Holy Name Society of St. Anthony's immediately went to prayer. They're dedicating the entire month of June to the daily offering of the Golden Arrow prayer through the Sacred Heart of Jesus for the preservation of the traditional Mass in our diocese. I've seen some ugly comments about the SSPX in the past couple of weeks from online trolls, people who make a living on click revenue who are profiting off of this crisis. The families of the SSPX chapel in Charlotte are good people. This is a small window into the spirituality of these people. And so the SSPX are doing the Catholic response, which is to pray for the situation in Charlotte. They're praying the Golden Arrow prayer through the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Seems appropriate during the month of the Sacred Heart. I'm curious, though, what you think about this. Ryan Gabriel says they are so bad at being schismatic. Yeah, I mean, who's ever heard of a schismatic group putting a picture of the Pope and the local bishop in their chapels? And I've been to an SSPX chapel a few times, the one near me. They had a picture at the time of Pope Francis and Archbishop Coakley, my archbishop, in their parish. Worst schismatics ever if they're actually, recognizing the local authority to some degree, even if they're resisting on things they disagree with. But I'm curious what you think about this in the comments. What's the doctrine asked? Did Pope Francis squash the Latin Mass while Pope Benedict was alive? Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And Archbishop Gonswein, who was the personal secretary to both Pope Francis and Pope Benedict before Francis reassigned him to be helping Benedict full-time, said it was like heartbreaking for Benedict when it happened. Was Cardinal Roach actually reassigned? No, he was not, Michael Glowacki. That was satire. I actually addressed that just a few minutes ago. That was a satire post that people have a really hard time because we live in such bizarre times now, being able to tell fact from fiction. Things that are now considered normal and that you are a bad person if you do not recognize the validity of would have been considered were the subject of satire 20 years ago. And that's why people have a hard time now differentiating satire from reality. Cardinal Roach was not reassigned to the Falkland Islands. That was a post from a satirical, very well-known satirist, by the way, which is why I was surprised it took off, because Eccles is Saved, the blog, is actually pretty famous in Catholic circles, and his social media accounts are very popular. Most people following him know he's a satirist. All right, folks. I'm curious, though, what else you might have to say about this in the comments, so let me know, please. And hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It absolutely does help. Sharing this on social media helps too. And if you've ever thought about supporting the work we do here at Return to Tradition, Patreon, Subscribe Star, the join button, all those options, they do keep these daily messages coming and it is greatly appreciated. Pray for the Pope, pray for Bishop Martin, pray for Cardinal Roach, and as always, pray for the Church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.